We are in Chapter 11, Section 1, and we're going to start talking about the origins of World War II. Before we start, I want to look at the essential question for what we're going to be talking about today, and it's, could World War II have been prevented? Meaning that what other things could we have done to stop World War II from escalating to the type of conflict that it really was? So, in the years that followed World War I, aggressive and expansionist governments took power in Europe, in Asia, and meanwhile Americans, we didn't want to be involved in another fight or another foreign war. The problem, of course, after World War I was we spent so much money, we came through, we had an age of happiness. Unfortunately, we went into a depression where our economy started to slow and struggle to the point where we fell ourselves into that Great Depression. Meanwhile, in Europe, after the Treaty of Versailles, economic depression is going to follow all across Europe. When we were trying to help Germany pay their war debts, it was important for us to see what was happening and what kind of settlement what type of political action was taking place. The anti-democratic states are going to eventually break peace agreements that have ended after World War I. So why is World War II so important? Well, it's the most destructive war in history. It resulted in the death of over 40 million people. And out of this, the United States emerged as a true, strongest nation in the world and a true superpower, which we hold that status to this day. Other key questions as I continue this discussion are, why were the dictators coming into power in the 1920s and 1930s? And what action led to the outbreak of World War II? So as we discuss this, you'll see, I'm going to go through briefly and introduce you to the dictators, what they are, who they are, and what happened along the way. The first thing you're going to see is you're going to have a rise of dictators, and these are people who rise to power by taking advantage of other people's anger and suffering. We typically see this in countries that are, going through a recession or depression. Some presented the different terms from the Treaty of Versailles and looked for, how do I find somebody who's going to make my life a little bit better? Meaning, I'm very unhappy with what I am, and I need to find somebody else there. So now if the whole society was really struggling, like countries like Germany and Italy, they were willing to take different steps in different directions to find and solve a problem. People like Adolf Hitler and other leaders promised a better life, and they were able to attract through the media and through propaganda. Dictators are leaders who control their nations by force, meaning that we know that after World War I, we had a lot of strong democratic allies. Unfortunately, those type of powers kind of fell apart besides England and France. So when we look at some of the countries, the first we'll talk about is Italy. And in Italy, there's a famous person named Benito Mussolini. He practiced the idea of fascism. And fascism is extreme nationalism and racism. When somebody says nationalism, it sounds like a good term. Like, I want to be very strong in my national beliefs. But nationalism in this sense is the belief that everybody else is wrong, and that everything else is just kind of infuriating or involving itself in something that shouldn't be. Meaning that we can't accept other people's cultures, we can't accept other people's races because we have our own identity. So fascism in Italy was the whole idea of, how do we bring everybody else there, have a pure society, and not let anybody else come out there. Italy was very fearful of the idea of communism. So it ended democratic rule over Italy, and it limited the free press and civil liberties of its people, meaning that once the person Mussolini comes into power, he quickly finds a way to strip the power of other people in order to make himself better or stronger. He forced children to enter military organizations at young ages to start to create a military style of school, and his forces annexed countries of Ethiopia and Albania, meaning that after the World War I, when we said we were going to start to break up the whole idea of colonies, he was able to go through and try to find other places. Ethiopia, very interesting because it had a very much a European style government, and Albania because of its wealth in the north part of Africa. Besides Italy, what we know the most about is Germany. The Great Depression is going to hit Germany extremely hard. Remember, the United States was the people who were funding the war reparations through loans, and when the U.S. economy started to struggle, they had to stop paying to Germans. So Germans became so filthy poor that their money was not actually worth anything. I believe I showed in the last chapter the German mark being used as wallpaper because it actually had more value as wallpaper than it did as spending cash. So Germans rallied around Adolf Hitler, who's going to be the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. He's going to become the Chancellor of Germany in 1933, and a Chancellor is somebody who's close to a prime minister or a leader. And he's going to have many expansion plans. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about him because there's a lot of stuff in the book about it. But one thing that I'll say is he was a Australian-born man. He came to Germany. He was arrested during an uprising. He fought for Germany during World War I. While his time in jail, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which was My Struggle. It claimed that Germans, particularly blonde-haired, blue-eyed Germans, belonged as a master race, and he called those people the Aryans. Everybody else was not welcome in German land. But the irony of this is, Hitler himself was from Austria. And a lot of people have stated after the fact, a lot of historians have studied to say that Hitler himself had Jewish blood in him. So when we start talking about the Holocaust and the things that are happening, you'll see that it's really tough to come out and get a picture of the true insanity of Adolf Hitler. So in Japan, you're going to see military powers rise, leaders through power. There's going to be attacks in Manchuria in 1931. And Japan is going to sign a pact of alliance called the Axis with Germany and Italy. And now, this is one thing that when I study history, when you're talking about this rogue nation who fought alongside the United States in World War I, now decides that they're going to go against the United States. Well, when I just talked about Germany and Germany saying this whole master race, what type of similarities would you see between a master race of blonde-haired, blue-eyed people and the people of Japan? So it's kind of an oxymoron, where an enemy of my enemy might just be my friend. So Japan is going to be on the other side of the Pacific, and we're not going to be very fearful of Japan until they actually get active into it. Soviet Union. Soviet Union, this is a really interesting part. We talked about during World War I. The Soviets had their communist revolution. Stalin's going to rise to power in the late 20s. He's going to create a communist government or continue that communist government. He's going to demand complete obedience from people that he ruled. He executes all his rivals and he reorganizes the nation's economy. Interesting articles I've read about Stalin was when he would remove somebody or fire somebody from his power, he would actually have them photoshopped or edited out of photos, which you think about during that time, time period to paint over, things like that. Kind of an interesting perspective to show you how truly insane he was. And then the United States is going to realize after the fact, after World War II is going to end, that Joseph Stalin was doing just about as bad of things to his people as these other nations, these other dictators were doing to their people, murdering, creating unnatural famines, just a crazy amount of insanity. So the United States is going to align itself with Soviet Union, and afterwards we're going to become brutal enemies. So the United States is going to be completely neutral. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I have another section here, but most Americans wanted to avoid the involvements in the international conflicts. There are going to be multiple different neutrality acts that are going to say people are going to restrict trades in nations who could pay cash for goods. And American loans to Europe and countries from World War I are going to remain unpaid. There's going to be something called the Munich Pact, and this is going to be an organization where Britain and France thought they could avoid war through appeasement. Meaning that after the Treaty of Versailles came, we said that we were not going to ever let this happen again. And leaders agreed to turn the Sudetenland over to Germany. Well, what's the Sudetenland? Sudetenland was a period, an area of land where there was going to be no military conflict, sort of a neutral zone. You had the Rhineland on France, and you had the Sudetenland to Austria. Hitler promised to no further expand its territory any further. Unfortunately, Hitler was a giant liar, and in 1939, his army is going to seize the rest of Czechoslovakia to the south, and they're going to literally occupy this. So we've said that Britain and France are going to have this area of appeasement where we believe them, and I don't say we, I say the people of Europe. I don't know if they actually believe them, but they were just so fed up with the idea of being in a war that they let it go. Besides that, the Nazis are going to have a Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939 where Hitler and Stalin are going to sign over the Soviet-German pact. It's going to be a non-aggression pact. They pledged not to attack each other, and secretly they wanted to divide other countries in Europe to grow their own empire. But the problem, of course, is that both of them were gigantic liars, so it makes it very difficult to see who to trust with each other. So The Soviets are going to say, well, we're not going to trust, they're going to attack back, and Germany is going to be looking for more Lebensraum, which is going to be more living space, and after they're going to tackle or attack and conquer most of Europe, the next place they're going to look towards is the Soviet Union. So even though they had a pact together, you cannot trust people who are not trustworthy. So I'm going to leave you with this question. How did post-war conditions contribute to the rise of dictatorships in Europe? We'll be talking about that in our next lecture.